I first noticed the orange flags staked into the grass one quiet Wednesday morning, fluttering in the breeze just beyond my backyard fence. At first, I assumed they were markers for a landscaping project, maybe new sod for the HOA maintained common area, or irrigation lines for those useless flower beds they obsess over. But then, the sound of heavy equipment rolled in like distant thunder, and the ground trembled as a backhoe carved a scar across the creek bed. No one had said a word. No notice, no vote. Not even one of those smug flyers they usually stuff in our mailboxes whenever someone's mailbox post needs repainting. Just cones, flags, and men in dusty vests who refused to look me in the eye when I stepped out to ask what was going on. The foreman muttered something about HOA infrastructure improvement, then turned his back and barked at his crew to keep moving. That's when I knew something was wrong. I've lived in Haven Ridge Estates for 9 years. Moved here after retiring from the Army, 27 years in logistics and field engineering with more deployments under my belt than I like to count. I chose this neighborhood because it promised peace and predictability, or at least the suburban version of it, clean sidewalks, decent schools for my daughter, and a house with enough yard that I could still mow on weekends and feel useful. But peace doesn't last when people in red polos start playing builder with other people's money. The bridge, as I would come to learn they were calling it, wasn't part of any HOA plan I'd ever seen. Not in the blueprints when I moved in, not in the annual meetings I dragged myself to every February, and certainly not something our dues were supposed to cover. It was being constructed over a seasonal creek that only ran high during storms, serving more as a runoff channel than anything else. My lot backed up directly to it, and I knew that terrain better than most. I'd hiked it with my daughter, tested the soil after rains, and even helped dig sandbags when a flash flood rolled through back in 19. This land moved when you didn't respect it. And from what I saw, the HOA was doing everything but. The contractor they hired, I never caught the company name, and the workers had no visible logos, started pouring concrete less than a week after breaking ground. No rebar visible, no excavation deep enough to suggest real support. I watched from my back porch, arms crossed, heart sinking. Every instinct I had screamed that it was a disaster in slow motion. So I did what any responsible homeowner with a military background and a fierce protective streak would do. I started taking notes, photos, dates, sketches. I emailed the HOA asking for permits. No reply. I showed up at the next board meeting standing in the back while they spent 40 minutes arguing about shrub heights. When I asked point blank who authorized the bridge project, they blinked at me like I'd just insulted their kids. Karen Westerly, the HOA president. Yes, her name was really. Karen leaned forward in her chair with that icy realtor smile and said, "Mr. Callahan, the board has reviewed the project and deemed it necessary for improved community access. No details, no vote numbers. Just that syrupy tone that tells you she thinks you're beneath her pressed blouse and designer reading glasses. Improved access for who? The only people who might benefit from that bridge lived on my street, and all of us already had driveways. There was no community event center over there, no park, no school drop-off, just a muddy tract of land prone to flooding and now gouged open by backhoes and questionable ambition." By the third week, a rough concrete slab stretched across the creek bed, elevated just enough to block the natural flow of water. Storm drains were nowhere in sight. I noticed they were using cheap gravel and uneven fill under the supports, if you could even call them supports. One side sank noticeably lower than the other after just 2 days of heavy rain. I brought this up again to the board, sent emails with time-stamped pictures, no reply. But by then, I knew this wasn't about oversight, it was about power. They didn't like being questioned, especially not by someone with a resume that could outrank their entire voting bloc. That week, my daughter Lily, who had just turned 11, asked me why I was angry every time we passed the bridge. I told her I wasn't angry. I was trying to stop something bad before it happened. She looked at me with those smart brown eyes, the ones she got from her mom, and said, "You always say that about people who don't listen." I smiled and patted her shoulder. She wasn't wrong. By the time the rebar finally went in crooked and misaligned, I knew it was only a matter of time before everything cracked open, literally and figuratively. All it would take was one good storm to wash away their lies. and in the distance, dark clouds were already building. 2 days after they poured the final layer of concrete, I watched a dump truck roll across the slab with a clumsy sort of defiance. It wobbled, yes, wobbled under the weight. From where I stood at my kitchen window, I saw the far side of the bridge dip by at least 2 inches as the rear tires bumped over the edge. The load shifted. The gravel inside sloshed forward, the tailgate rattling like loose teeth. I dropped my coffee mug right there in the sink. There was no way a properly engineered bridge should be flexing like that under a routine delivery. Not after only 2 days of curing, and not if the load rating had been calculated correctly. But then again, nothing about this build was correct. Not the speed, not the materials, and certainly not the oversight. I stepped outside, phone in hand, and started recording. The foreman saw me and walked over, trying to block my view like some dime store bouncer. His vest had no company name. His hard hat was clean, too clean for a guy supposedly working 12-hour days in the mud. He gave me a half smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You filming for fun, or are you gonna be a problem? I'm a homeowner," I said, voice calm but firm. "And I'm also a retired Army engineer. What I'm seeing here violates at least 3 basic standards of foundational construction." "Cool story, Grandpa," he said, and turned back to bark orders at his crew. I could have laughed if it wasn't so insulting. In the Army, I built temporary bridges in combat zones under mortar fire. I oversaw logistics in landslides and flash floods. I coordinated troop movements across unstable river crossings, where a single miscalculation meant 10 lives lost in seconds. That man had no idea who he was dismissing. But I wasn't interested in convincing him. I was gathering proof. That night, I opened my old footlocker from the garage. Inside were binders thick with Army Corps manuals, FEMA disaster zone protocol, and soil erosion maps I'd helped annotate back in the 90s. It felt like unearthing a part of myself I hadn't touched in years. I flipped through the pages by lamplight, matching diagrams to what I'd seen that morning. The slope was too steep. The creek bed hadn't been prepped or reinforced. The concrete lacked proper rebar density. Worst of all, the floodplain had shifted in the last decade due to upstream development, and this bridge sat squarely in the overflow zone. I even had aerial maps from a year before showing water levels breaching that exact spot. It wasn't just negligence. It was a ticking time bomb. The next morning, I typed up a report. I attached photos, video clips, and scans of engineering diagrams. I emailed it to the HOA board, CCing the property management company and the local municipal building inspector's office. I included my credentials, a respectful cover letter, and a clear conclusion: this structure is dangerous, likely non-compliant with city code, and built without proper hydrological planning. No response. But 3 hours later, I received a notice taped to my front door. "Dear Mr. Callahan," it read in sterile courier font, "your conduct has been deemed disruptive and hostile toward contracted workers and board-approved projects. Further interference may result in formal HOA violations under Covenant 9.3. Interference with community improvements." I stared at the paper for a full minute before laughter bubbled up from my chest. They were trying to silence me with bureaucracy. Later that week, my trash bins mysteriously weren't collected, even though they were at the curb before sunrise. My mailbox was stuffed with redundant newsletters warning against antagonistic homeowner behavior. And at the Saturday block party, an event I used to enjoy with Lily neighbors gave me tight-lipped smiles and wandered away mid-conversation. The HOA had clearly begun its whisper campaign. I wasn't surprised. Karen Westerly had a long memory for perceived slights. She once tried to sanction a homeowner for painting their shutters 2 shades darker than approved pine green. This bridge wasn't just a project to her, it was an emblem of control. And now I was the wrench in her gears, but what they didn't know was that I'd already started compiling a separate file, a legal one. I consulted a friend from my Army days, Luis, now a city building inspector in another county. I sent him everything I had. He couldn't act officially, but he gave me a list of precise violations to cite and the exact form numbers to request from City Hall. He also advised me to file a Freedom of Information Act request with the HOA's management company. "That'll force their hand," he said. If they faked permits, that request makes them either produce or panic. So I did. And I made sure to hand-deliver a copy of the FOIA letter to the management company with a signed timestamp. Within 48 hours, construction halted. No explanation, no update. Just a padlocked gate around the worksite and a printed sign that read, "Under review, do not enter." I'd rattled their cage. But that was just the surface. I still hadn't gotten answers, and I wasn't the only one noticing the silence. At the next HOA meeting, a woman named Beatrice, who lived near the far end of the creek, stood up and asked if anyone else had seen water pooling behind their fences. Then a man named Arjun, who worked in IT, asked why the HOA was spending over $80,000 on a project no one voted for. Karen fumbled, claimed the board had executive discretionary authority under Article 14. She waved around a clipboard full of vague contractor assessments, but wouldn't let anyone read them. People weren't buying it anymore. I sat quietly in the back, watching the crack form, not in concrete, but in their grip on the neighborhood. Just like the bridge, their foundation was weaker than they thought. And the first big storm would expose everything. It was only a matter of time. After that meeting, the air in Haven Ridge Estates changed. There was an uneasiness rippling through the neighborhood like wind before a thunderclap. Neighbors started whispering over fences again, but this time not about who wasn't edging their lawn or whose dog barked too loud at night. They were talking about the bridge, about permits that didn't exist, about an HOA that had stopped answering even basic questions. I gave it 3 days, 3 days of silence, of no crews, returning to the site of that sad little padlock, swinging from the construction fence like a warning bell no one wanted to hear. Then I called the management company, directly Clearview Community Solutions, and asked to speak to their regional compliance officer. The receptionist, with the perkiness of someone trained to smile while denying you everything, said that no one was available and someone would return my call within 7 to 10 business days. They never did. Instead, I got another envelope slipped into my mailbox. Another violation. This one accused me of unauthorized surveillance of private contractors and attempting to discredit the HOA in a public forum. They called my recorded videos and timestamps distorted representations and warned that continued behavior may result in formal escalation to legal counsel. Legal counsel. That made me laugh out loud until I remembered these people weren't bluffing. They weren't the kind to take accountability. They were the kind who would twist bylaws until they choked you with them. So I stopped calling. I started documenting everything. Every muddy footprint leading from the construction site to the back of Karen's property, every delivery truck that showed up without labeled credentials, every conversation I overheard while walking the dog in the evenings. And it wasn't just me anymore. Beatrice started emailing me screenshots of conversations from the HOA Facebook group that were mysteriously getting deleted comments from residents asking why the contractor wasn't licensed with the state. Arjun sent me PDFs he found buried in an old HOA budget proposal where the creek crossing project was labeled low-vis maintenance path, allocated under disaster readiness, with no further explanation. Low visibility indeed. At one point, I stood across the street from the clubhouse with my arms folded as a flatbed truck tried to quietly haul away the last pallet of cracked pavers they'd used to reinforce the bridge slope. I recorded the whole thing. When the driver noticed, he hopped down, told me he had orders from the top, and that was all he knew. I nodded. Told him politely, "You might want to ask for those in writing next time." The video went straight to the state contractor board. That night, I received a message in my HOA portal inbox, those annoying little logins they give you to check your dues and see outdated minutes from meetings they never really hold. It was from Karen herself, just one sentence. Mr. Callahan continued, "Antagonism will not be tolerated. Cease your activities immediately." She didn't sign it sincerely, just that. But here's the thing about bullies in blazers and pearls: they think they're in control until they meet someone who doesn't flinch. I replied with a link to the city's whistleblower protection statute. Then I took Lily out for ice cream because I'd promised her I'd stop checking my phone every 5 minutes and focus on something sweet for once. She chose mint chip. I picked Rocky Road because life felt exactly like that lately. When we got back, I noticed a car parked outside our house. A black SUV, tinted windows, not a neighbor's, not any crew I recognized. It idled for a long minute, then drove off slowly. I told myself I was imagining things, but I also made sure the motion lights in the backyard were working. That Sunday, I walked the entire perimeter of the bridge site again. The water line on the creek wall had risen even without rain. I noticed several new cracks forming along the edge of the slab. One of the temporary support poles, wood not steel, had warped slightly bowed outward like a splinter under strain. I could hear it groaning when I stood close. I called a contact I hadn't spoken to in over a year. Daniel Lynn, a structural engineer who used to consult for FEMA. We met during a mudslide response in Arizona, back when I still wore the uniform and barked orders into radios. Daniel wasn't a man of many words, but when I sent him the footage, his email came back in less than 5 minutes. That's gonna fail. Badly. Get people away from it. So I printed new flyers. Not the HOA's neat little trifolds with branding and fake smiles. Mine were plain black and white bold font, "This structure is unsafe. Stay back." Engineered for seasonal flow, not load-bearing weight. Uninspected. Built without verified permits. Evidence has been submitted to city officials. I walked the neighborhood with Lily that afternoon, and every mailbox got one. I didn't knock. I didn't argue. I let the words speak for themselves. The next day, 2 teenagers riding bikes nearly crashed when they hit a new sinkhole at the base of the bridge's far ramp. One of their parents came to my door that night. He was shaken. He asked if what I'd written was true. I invited him inside, showed him everything. The documents, the videos, the silence. He left my house 30 minutes later and called 4 other families on my street. By morning, we had a group chat going. A real one. Not the HOA's curated nonsense, but a private secure line between neighbors who were finally waking up to what was being done in our name. That same week, the HOA announced a special safety review to be conducted by an independent contractor. The contractor turned out to be Karen's brother-in-law, according to a friend who used to work with him at a landscaping firm 2 towns over. Independent my ass. They scheduled it for a Friday afternoon when most people would be at work and sent notice only 2 hours before. Was ready. I showed up in boots, arms, folded phone in one hand, and my Army-issued engineering manual tucked under the other arm, like a badge of war. When the inspector arrived, I politely introduced myself. "Retired Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Callahan," I said. "I'll be observing." He didn't say a word, but his hands were shaking. By the time August rolled in, the heat had baked the ground so dry it fractured in places. The grass in most yards had gone from emerald to hay. Cicadas buzzed through the afternoon stillness like static on a broken radio. But even in the lull of summer, something underneath Haven Ridge was shifting, something less visible than drought, but just as dangerous. And I wasn't the only one who felt it anymore. That Friday safety inspection had gone exactly as I expected, Hollow. The so-called inspector did a single lap around the slab, snapped a few photos from the sidewalk, and left without taking a single measurement. No soil probes, no structural stress test, no water flow analysis. Just a man with a clipboard and a rehearsed nod. 2 days later, the HOA released a memo declaring the bridge structurally sound and completed within acceptable variants of approved plans. They attached a PDF titled Safety Certification, Internal Review Document. It had no signatures, no engineer's seal, no county letterhead. I printed it and taped it above my desk like a trophy of their arrogance. But I wasn't done watching. The signs of failure weren't just technical, they were physical now, and undeniable. One evening, as I walked the dog past the site, I noticed fresh soil displacement at the south end of the bridge. The embankment, supposedly reinforced with gravel and mesh, had sunken several inches. A thick crack had formed just off the eastern corner. Nothing dramatic yet, but it hadn't been there last week. I took close-up photos, then pulled back for a wider angle, using a spirit level app on my phone, to confirm the slope had shifted almost 6 degrees. Worse water was pooling in strange places upstream. That was the most alarming part. The bridge hadn't just been poorly built, it had actually redirected flow. The natural runoff that usually curved into the low marsh had been blocked, forcing excess water to press against the base of my neighbor's fencing. At first, it was just soft dirt, then puddles, then mud thick enough to trap a wheelbarrow. I knew what was coming next: undermining, and then collapse. The community chat we'd started had grown into something almost secretive, a kind of underground resistance. We met weekly now, not in public parks or community centers. Karen had tried to shut those down, but in garages, kitchens, and once even at Arjun's detached shed. It felt like something out of a Cold War novel. Flashlights, printed maps, whispered terms like runoff coefficient and load failure thresholds. I'd never thought suburban life would lead me to covert strategy sessions, but here we were. One evening, Beatrice brought an old binder she'd found in her attic. Her late husband had served on the HOA board, back when it was still community-run and accountable. Inside were blueprints from 15 years ago, the original water runoff design for the neighborhood. According to those plans, the area where the bridge now stood had been specifically excluded from development due to its role in stormwater dispersion. In other words, that land was meant to flood. It was a designed pressure valve for the entire block. By building the bridge, the HOA had effectively corked the bottle. My stomach twisted. They hadn't just cut corners, they'd ignored a foundational safeguard. I contacted Luis again, my old army buddy turned inspector. He wasn't allowed to act officially out of jurisdiction, but he offered me something better: an introduction. A state hydrologist named Natalie Tran, who lived 2 towns over and had dealt with floodplain manipulation before. When I called, she agreed to meet in person on one condition: no photos, no recordings. We met under a pergola at the edge of Spring Hollow Park. I showed her everything: photos, the sunken slope, the water pools, Beatrice's old binder. She barely spoke until I finished. Then she sighed, closed the binder gently, and said, "You're absolutely right. That bridge is a dam waiting to burst, and whoever approved it is either lying or dangerously incompetent. Can you help us? I can report it anonymously through the State Hydrology Board," she said. "But it'll take time. Unless something catastrophic happens, they'll bury it in paperwork." Time we didn't have. The forecast called for the first heavy rain of the season, 3 days of storms coming down from the north, soaking the clay-rich hills behind us. I knew from experience that once those hills hit saturation, everything downhill turned into soup. And our neighborhood, with its shiny new dam disguised as a bridge, was right in the crosshairs. I warned the group. We created a flyer, not dramatic, not panicked, just factual. Notice to homeowners: expected heavy rain may impact drainage in common areas. Please report all flooding immediately. We printed 200 copies and slipped them into mailboxes at dawn before the HOA's patrol could intercept them. We also started sandbagging. Not officially, of course. Karen had forbidden any unsanctioned landscaping interference. But my garage had 50 surplus military-issue sandbags from my last deployment, and I wasn't about to let rules stop me from protecting my daughter's room from flooding. When the first drops fell, I was ready. The rain came hard and fast, sheet-like, loud against the roof. By midnight, the creek had swollen into a brown, roaring artery thick with silt and debris. I stood on the back porch with a flashlight watching the current slam against the slab. And then I saw it. The water wasn't going under the bridge anymore. It was backing up. The channel had narrowed, funneled to a crawl beneath the concrete. Debris, branches, trash, even an old lawn chair had jammed the opening. The water climbed and climbed. By dawn, it spilled over. My phone lit up with messages. Arjun backyard is flooding. Fence collapsed. Beatrice water coming through vent's basement smells like mold already. Luis even, out of state, get people out now. That bridge is redirecting force, check low elevation homes. Natalie, if that soil isn't compacted underneath, it'll breach from the side. Lateral shear. You could lose the whole slope. I didn't need the warning. I pulled on my boots, grabbed my flashlight, and headed down the slope behind my house. The far bank had already begun to slide. A wet sucking sound followed every step. Earth that should have been packed like a sponge was turning to pudding. I saw the first signs of washout hairline cracks stretching along the side, like veins under strain. The kind of cracks that whispered, "I'm about to break." Then came the worst sound I'd heard in years. Not a boom, not a snap, just a low, rumbling groan, like a creature waking up beneath your feet. The bridge shifted. One corner dropped 3 inches in under a second. I backed away. Breath caught in my throat. The rain fell harder, and somewhere in the distance someone finally screamed. The scream jolted me harder than the thunder. I spun around, flashlight beam darting across the pouring chaos. It wasn't Lily, thank God. It came from across the creek, Beatrice's side. I recognized her porch light flicking on, glowing weakly through the rain like a beacon barely holding back the dark. I sprinted back toward the houseboots, sloshing through water, now ankle-deep in places where dry grass had been just hours earlier. Lily met me at the door, eyes wide with fear, but steady. "Is it collapsing?" she asked. "Not yet," I said, trying to catch my breath, "but it's close. Grab your go-bag, sweetheart. Just in case." She nodded and dashed off without another word. We'd packed emergency bags years ago after the wildfire scare. She remembered. I yanked the breaker to kill outside power and grabbed my radio, an old military-grade handheld I kept in the kitchen drawer. Static crackled, then the familiar voice of awe. Arjun broke through. "Tom, it's bad. The water's up to my back steps. Beatrice's shed just floated into the fence. Copy that. I'm coming to you. Hold tight." I left Lily with strict instructions not to leave the house and ran hood, pulled over my head every step, a slip between mud and panic. By the time I reached Arjun's place, the entire rear of his property had turned into a swamp. His newly installed French drain system, meant to protect against mild rain, was overwhelmed, bubbling up like a broken soda can. Beatrice stood barefoot, in her robe, water up to her calves, shouting into her phone.
"They're telling me it's not an emergency!"
she cried. "They said to call the HOA.
"Give me the phone!"
I barked. She handed it to me without hesitation. A sleepy-sounding operator answered. "Haven Ridge, emergency line, non-emergency dispatch." "This is Thomas Callahan," I snapped. "We have rising water levels breaching containment. You need to contact municipal flood response now." "I'm sorry, sir, but we don't have jurisdiction unless an official HOA representative files a hazard request." I hung up. The HOA had blocked emergency services unless they approved the call. My blood boiled. By noon, word of the flooding spread. Residents started showing up at the bridge, ignoring the taped-off perimeter and Karen's ridiculous signs. The creek had turned into a brown river, curling over the slab in a wide, hungry spiral, chewing away at its own edges. A chunk of concrete had already sheared off the northwest corner. That's when the HOA finally emerged from their clubhouse bunker umbrellas and clipboards in hand. Karen Westerly, soaked in rain, but still wearing heels, marched up to me as if she still ran the world. "You are inciting panic," she snapped, voice raised over the storm. "Your interference has caused unnecessary distress and confusion. The situation is under review." Under review, I pointed behind her. "The water's inside Beatrice's kitchen. Arjun's sump pump is dead. The bridge is falling apart under its own weight, and you blocked emergency access for a vanity project that violated runoff zoning." She blanched, just for a second, then composed herself. "If you continue to slander the board with these baseless accusations," she said, "you will face legal consequences." "Good," I said, stepping forward, "because I've already submitted a full case to the county attorney's office, complete with evidence. Video, permit requests that never existed, inspection fraud. Want to see the time-stamped FOIA responses? I've got them laminated." Her umbrella dipped slightly. Rain pelted her face. "You're bluffing." That's when Louis showed up. He wasn't supposed to be there. He was technically out of jurisdiction, and his presence could be seen as overstepping. But I'd sent him photos of the latest slope shift, and he'd made a call. One I hadn't expected. Behind him, a white city truck pulled up. Two men climbed out, one from the Department of Water Resources, the other a building compliance officer. Real badges, real clipboards. Karen turned white. They didn't even look at her. They walked straight to the bridge, ignoring her objection, stepping over her flimsy plastic barrier. The compliance officer motioned for his partner. I watched as they crouched at the sunken edge and ran gloved fingers along the crumbling concrete. The inspector turned. "Who's the reporting party?" I raised my hand. He nodded. "You called this in." 6 weeks ago, I said. "And again this morning. You'll find multiple emails and flagged photos already in your system under my name. Callahan. Thomas." He scribbled something on his pad. Karen hissed, "You went outside the association." "No," I said. "I went above it." And just like that, the tide turned. They closed the bridge to all foot traffic and cordoned off the area. By late afternoon, a backhoe was brought in to brace the structure from further collapse. Lily and I watched from our porch as yellow tape fluttered in the wind, like justice snapping into place. But that wasn't the end. That evening, I received a packet by certified mail. Notice of HOA disciplinary action, Level 3 violation. It accused me of defamation incitement, unauthorized communication with third-party agencies, and willful disruption of HOA-sanctioned infrastructure improvements. They fined me $3,500. I read it twice, then laughed. $3,000 for saving this neighborhood from a disaster they were too arrogant to see coming. I would have paid double. But I didn't. Instead, I drafted a response with the help of a friend who worked as a paralegal. I cited precedent community safety clauses, whistleblower protection laws, and most importantly, the section of our HOA bylaws that stated, "No homeowner shall be penalized for actions taken in defense of life, property, or public safety in the absence of direct HOA intervention." I attached photographic evidence of the flooding, scans of old community zoning maps, testimony from Beatrice and Arjun, a formal notice of appeal. Then I filed a complaint with the state HOA regulatory board. Karen responded with silence, until the legal threat came delivered via email this time. A lawyer representing the HOA demanded I cease public dissemination of unverified claims or face a civil suit. I didn't reply. Instead, I posted the entire PDF trail, the photos, and the inspection notes from the city on a new community forum that Arjun built overnight. He called it Haven Ridge Unfiltered. It went viral, at least by HOA standards. Within 24 hours, 87 homeowners joined. Karen didn't just lose control, she lost the neighborhood. The next morning, I awoke to sirens. At first, I thought it was a dream, some echo from old deployments, a memory bleeding through the cracks of sleep. But as I blinked against the dim light filtering through the bedroom blinds, I realized it was real. Not just one siren, but several. Then the rhythmic chop of a helicopter overhead, the thrum of urgency in the air. I jumped from bed and threw on boots, calling out for Lily. She was already in the hallway, clutching her go bag. "Dad, it's happening, isn't it?" I nodded once. "Stay inside. Don't open the door unless it's me or Officer Jennings." Jennings was the local beat cop who lived on our street, a good man. Knew Lily's name and handed out candy canes at Christmas. I'd given him a heads up the night before. When I stepped onto the porch, the sight that greeted me stole my breath. The bridge was gone. Not partially collapsed, not sagging, gone. A jagged wound where it had stood, now just swirling frothy water, surging through what looked like a battlefield. Slabs of concrete jutted from the creek bed like broken teeth. Rebar twisted in the current. Someone's patio chair bobbed along with shattered fencing. The far side of the bank had completely eroded. Trees lay uprooted, their roots ripped from the soil. Beatrice's entire back shed, what was left of it, was lodged against a fallen tree 20 feet downstream. The slope behind Arjun's house had slumped into a landslide of mud and stone, barely stopping short of his foundation. And in the middle of it all stood Karen Westerly, drenched to the bone mascara, streaking like war paint, screaming at two firefighters as if she still held command. "I told you to put up barricades last night," she shrieked. "This is negligence. I want names. I want someone arrested." The firefighter, a woman barely 30, looked at her with a face full of practiced calm. "Ma'am, we've been requesting access to this area for weeks. You denied hazard assessments. You blocked city agencies from evaluating the infrastructure. That's on you." Karen sputtered, then saw me. "You," she roared. "This is your fault. You undermined the board. You stirred up fear. You're the reason this happened." I didn't move, just met her glare and said clearly enough for the crowd to hear, "No, Karen. You are. You built a bridge where one should never have existed, ignored every warning, and silenced every voice that didn't praise you. And now the land is speaking louder than you ever could." People turned. Faces I'd only known in passing neighbors who once waved politely but kept their distance looked at me differently now. Some nodded. Some just stood in silence, water pooling at their boots. But I saw it in their eyes. They knew, and Karen. She broke. Right there in front of everyone, she dropped her clipboard, sank to her knees in the mud, and sobbed. Her cries were not the weeping of grief, but the wails of a woman whose kingdom had collapsed in front of her, whose throne had washed away with the current. The city officials arrived within the hour, 2 trucks, an engineering response team, and a news crew not far behind. Cameramen filmed the wreckage. One reporter, a local anchor named Marissa Leung, pulled me aside for comment. I hadn't planned on speaking, but when she asked, "Were there warnings?" I didn't hold back. "There were plenty," I said. "From multiple homeowners, from professionals, from the terrain itself. This wasn't just negligence. It was willful blindness." She nodded solemnly. "And what would you say to the board now?" I glanced back toward the clubhouse where HOA members huddled like beaten dogs under the overhang. Maybe now, I said, they'll start listening. That night, the mayor issued a statement. The city declared Haven Ridge a temporary flood hazard zone. The failed bridge triggered a broader investigation into HOA-controlled developments across the region. Emergency crews set up a mobile base in the clubhouse parking lot. The clubhouse itself, ironically elevated on a slight hill, became a shelter for families who had water in their basements. I spent the rest of the day helping haul sandbags for Beatrice. Arjun's basement flooded 3 feet deep, and we worked late with portable pumps and extension cords that trailed across driveways like lifelines. Teenagers from 3 streets over came with bottled water and blankets. Someone set up a propane stove and made coffee. It was the first time in years that Haven Ridge had actually felt like a community. But the fallout wasn't over. The following morning, I received a call from a representative of the State Office of Housing Oversight. They were opening an official inquiry. The inspector asked if I'd be willing to submit all evidence timelines and witness statements. I told him I already had it organized by folder. He chuckled. "You military types don't mess around." "No," I said. "We don't." Karen's resignation came 3 days later. It wasn't delivered in person, of course. Just a dry email sent through the HOA portal citing personal health reasons and ongoing emotional stress. But we all knew. 3 other board members followed. In their place, the city appointed a temporary oversight panel while elections were scheduled. And when nominations opened, something happened. I never expected Beatrice nominated me. I declined at first. I'd fought this battle to protect my home, not to inherit the mess. But Lily looked at me that night, over dinner, her eyes steady and solemn. "You told me once that people who stay quiet get ruled by people who don't care. If you don't run, who will?" So I did. Not because I wanted power, but because I now understood how easily it could be abused. The morning I submitted the full case file to the county office, the air felt different, lighter, like the storm had washed away something toxic from the marrow of our streets. The city clerk, a tired man in his 50s, with wire-rimmed glasses, and the calm patience of someone who had seen far worse, took the manila envelope from my hands and gave it a weighty glance. "Is this all of it?" he asked. Every permit request they falsified. Photos of unpermitted work, falsified inspection reports, copies of HOA memos, the original zoning maps. I even included 3 sworn statements from homeowners who were threatened with fines for asking questions. He nodded slowly. "We've been seeing more of this lately. These HOAs. They start out like neighborhood watch, then drift into private fiefdoms. It's the silence that lets them rot." I couldn't help but agree. Later that week, I was called into a formal interview with a city investigator. Her name was Elise Randall Sharp, suit sharper eyes, and the quiet, efficient way of asking questions that made you feel like truth would spill no matter how tightly you guarded it. But I wasn't hiding anything. I brought everything. We spent 2 hours walking through timelines, technical details, and HOA procedures or lack thereof. She was particularly interested in the FOIA responses I'd received. The fact that my requests turned up blank, where documents should have been, was damning. Worse yet, the board had listed funds for the bridge in 2 separate budgets under different names: drainage path, enhancement in one, and community access upgrade in the other, double-booked, obscured, possibly embezzled. This isn't just about negligence anymore, Elise said, tapping her pen. It could be criminal misrepresentation of funds, especially if dues money was diverted. I raised an eyebrow. You think someone was skimming? She didn't answer directly, but her silence was enough. And then 2 days later came the biggest bombshell yet. Louise forwarded me a leaked email chain, an internal thread between Karen Westerly and a local contractor, Nolan Reeves, who happened to be her cousin by marriage. The emails revealed that the bridge contract had been awarded without any bidding process. Nolan's company, which had no proper flood certification or structural engineering license, had billed over $96,000 for expedited construction services. Even worse, they'd requested that no soil integrity report be filed. I stared at the screen, the bile rising in my throat. They knew. They knew from the beginning that the ground wasn't stable. They knew the risk, and they built it anyway. With HOA funds. Without disclosure. Without safety precautions. Without permits. I printed the entire chain, included it in my updated case file, and dropped a separate copy in Elise's mailbox with a note attached. This wasn't an accident. That same night, the neighborhood forum erupted. Arjun had uploaded the files to the Haven Ridge unfiltered page, complete with annotated highlights and source links. Within an hour, the post had over 140 comments. People were furious. Not just because of the danger, but because of the deceit. Did they really use our dues to pay her cousin? My backyard is ruined. And now I know why. I paid that woman's salary, and she almost got my son killed. Time for lawsuits. One by one, residents came forward with their own stories. Fines they couldn't explain. Home repair denials with no basis. Threats for planting trees or installing rain barrels. And behind it all, the HOA's smug silence. Then Beatrice posted something I hadn't expected, a scanned copy of an old memo from 2014, when Karen had first joined the board. It was a letter she'd written urging the HOA to eliminate oversight from external agencies because it slowed down neighborhood progress. The final line, what Haven Ridge needs, is streamlined authority. It chilled me. Power wasn't just something Karen wielded. It was something she'd sought intentionally and methodically for years. And now finally, the cracks in her carefully constructed kingdom had split wide open. The county issued a formal injunction that week, halting all HOA spending authority until a full audit could be completed. A city financial examiner was assigned to the board. Bank accounts were frozen. Records were seized. The next board meeting was standing room only. Not in the clubhouse too small for the crowd, but in the high school gymnasium. City officials set up a portable podium. Local media filled the back row. The crowd buzzed like a hive, angry, confused, and ready for blood. Karen didn't show. Instead, a lawyer stood in her place, a bland man in a gray suit who looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. He read a prepared statement declaring Karen's resignation effective immediately and cited her devastating emotional distress as the reason for her absence. No apology, no accountability, just the echo of her retreat. Then the lawyer tried to speak about healing as a community, but I was already walking toward the microphone. "Excuse me," I said, voice clear-cutting through the auditorium's tension. "Before we talk about healing, let's talk about truth." And I laid it out, not with anger, not with vengeance, but with calm, deliberate precision. I told them about the bridge, about the fake inspection, about the misused funds, the threats, the manipulation. I held up the FOIA documents. I showed the emails. I displayed the original floodplain maps on a projector. I ended with a question. Do you want to be governed by people who hide or by people who serve? The room went silent. Then the applause started, soft at first, then growing until it echoed off the rafters like thunder on the roof of a burned-out bridge. I stepped down, and Haven Ridge stood up. The Monday following the town hall, the city's engineering task force arrived with clipboards, ground-penetrating radar, and soil compression rigs. They didn't come quietly. 4 trucks, 3 officials in high-visibility jackets, and a uniformed police presence to keep order. This wasn't a courtesy check. It was a full-scale inspection. They cordoned off the collapsed bridge site and began working in rotating shifts. I watched from the edge of the common lot as they deployed steel rods into the creek bank marked sections with neon flags and took soil samples every 10 feet. The lead inspector, a sharp-eyed woman named Rosa Alvarado, had come from the state capitol. I'd read about her once during a post-hurricane investigation. She didn't mince words, and she didn't tolerate cover-ups. I knew we were in good hands. Around noon, she waved me over. "You're Callahan," she asked. "Yes, ma'am. I read your submissions. They were unusually thorough. Military habit." She cracked a small smile, then handed me a printout of preliminary measurements. This slope failed weeks before the collapse. We found moisture lines from at least 10 days prior, meaning someone knew it was shifting and kept quiet. My chest tightened. What about the foundation? Non-existent. They poured over a thin gravel base with 0 subgrade reinforcement. Rebar was poorly spaced, and some pieces weren't even anchored. The load rating wouldn't pass for a garden path, much less a vehicle bridge. She flipped to the next page. And here's the kicker. We dug near the old runoff channel under the east end, found remnants of culverts and drainage mesh from the original 2007 water management system. That bridge cut straight across a designed flood route. I didn't say anything. I didn't have to. My silence was all the confirmation she needed. Rosa nodded once and walked away. By late afternoon, a second team began pulling HOA financial records. The city's audit division had obtained a subpoena, and the HOA's management company, Clearview, was now legally compelled to hand over every budget line transaction and correspondence going back 5 years. I heard the panic before I saw it. 2 blocks down at the HOA's temporary trailer office, the clubhouse was still closed due to mold from flooding. Denise Hollowell's, Karen's second-in-command, was pacing outside, in kitten heels and a trench coat, frantically waving her arms as 2 city officials loaded boxes into a van. "You can't take those, that's private HOA property. I demand a receipt." One of the auditors looked at her utterly unmoved. "You'll get a full itemized record after processing. Ma'am, step back." Denise spotted me across the street. Her eyes went wide with something between fury and dread. "This is your doing," she shrieked. "You've poisoned this community." I tilted my head. "No, Denise. You built a dam where a drainage system belonged. The land just told the truth, louder than I could." Later that evening, the internal HOA emails began to surface. Someone inside Clearview had leaked them, likely a junior staffer tired of being complicit. Arjun posted them to the Haven Ridge Unfiltered page. I spent hours combing through the threads. One string stood out immediately between Karen and Denise, dated 3 months prior to the collapse. Karen: "I don't want to go through city permitting. Too slow." Denise: "Then we label it as pathway restoration. Under Article 12, we don't need approval." Karen: "Perfect. Just make sure Nolan gets the bid. He's expecting it. Tell accounting to code it under stormwater upgrades." And there it was. Proof that the entire project had been a lie from the start. They'd exploited obscure language in the HOA covenants, manipulated budget entries, and funneled nearly 6 figures to Karen's cousin for a structure they knew wouldn't withstand seasonal floods. I could barely sleep that night, not because of anxiety, but because the weight of the truth had finally shifted. We were no longer the ones under scrutiny. They were. The next morning, Karen was served, not by police yet, but by a civil attorney representing a growing class action group of homeowners seeking damages for property loss and misappropriated dues. Arjun, Beatrice, and even 2 board members, who had since resigned, joined the suit. The legal team was formidable, a local firm that specialized in HOA abuse cases. And they didn't want a settlement. They wanted blood. News crews returned. This time, they filmed children standing outside their homes with sandbags still stacked by doorways. They interviewed parents about basements lost to mold retirees, whose garages had been inundated with floodwater. They asked me if I would testify. I said yes. But the most surreal moment came 3 days later when Nolan Reeves, the contractor, showed up unannounced at my house. I opened the door to find him on my porch, soaked in sweatshirt, untucked, a duffel bag in one hand, and a manila envelope in the other. "I need to talk," he said. I stepped outside, closing the door behind me. "I didn't think it would go this far," he said. "Karen told me the water stuff was exaggerated. She said it was just for aesthetics. I never saw any of the flood maps. You didn't ask for them," I replied. He looked down. I needed the contract. Times were hard. "She said it was just a walkway upgrade, nothing structural. I should have walked away, but..." He trailed off. "What's in the envelope?" "Invoices, the real ones. With the dates and amounts she told me to backdate. I also recorded one of our calls. She asked me to delete soil test results that said the grade was too soft." I stared at him. "You're ready to turn all this in. I don't want to get sued. Or worse. If I cooperate, maybe the city goes easier on me." I took the envelope. "Then, you'd better get yourself a lawyer." That night, I added Nolan's documents to the master folder and forwarded copies to Elise Randall at the City Investigation Office. Her reply was short: "This may qualify as criminal conspiracy. Moving to next phase." The bridge hadn't just fallen. It had detonated. Everything tied to it. The city held the public hearing on a brisk October morning, the kind where the air carries that subtle bite of fall, sharp, honest, and impossible to ignore. It was held downtown, not far from the county courthouse, in a repurposed library auditorium that now served as a civic forum, the same place they hosted school board debates and zoning proposals. But today, it was for something far less routine: the people of Haven Ridge Estates versus the HOA board. The turnout was overwhelming. By 8:30 a.m., the line to get inside curled down the block, homeowners clutching file folders, phones full of photos, some even with water-damaged items in tow. Mud-crusted photo albums, warped floorboards, rotted insulation, and cut from basement walls. This wasn't just testimony. It was evidence. Living proof that the collapse had ripped more than concrete from the ground. Inside, the air crackled with anticipation. The city had placed folding chairs in tight rows. A makeshift dais at the front held the council members, the head city auditor, a representative from the Department of Public Safety, and Elise Randall. She wore a navy blazer, a single braid tucked behind her shoulder, and that same focused intensity I'd seen during our interviews. A woman with no time for theater, only facts. Karen didn't sit with the crowd. She was escorted in by her attorney, looking pale and drawn. Gone was the HOA red blazer, replaced with a drab taupe suit 2 sizes too large. No clipboard. No entourage. Just the weight of everything she could no longer deny. I was called first. I walked to the microphone slowly, my boots echoing off the tile floor. I'd been in briefing rooms like this before: combat debriefings, post-op analyses, tactical reviews. This wasn't that different. Just civilians this time. Just neighbors who'd been kept in the dark long enough. I cleared my throat. "My name is Thomas Callahan. I live at 221 West Creek Circle. I'm a retired lieutenant colonel in the United States Army, served 27 years. I'm also a homeowner. And for the past 4 months, I've been trying to warn this board that their actions were endangering lives. I recounted everything: the unauthorized construction, the lack of permits, the ignored floodplain warnings, the falsified budget lines, the FOIA responses. I submitted copies of every document again for public record. I displayed side-by-side images, before and after the slope. The collapse, the water lines that reached into homes like fingers dragging secrets into the light. Then I told them about the children. Lily's friend Caleb, whose bike was nearly sucked into a sinkhole that formed days before the collapse. The neighbor down the street, whose 6-year-old daughter was pulled out of a flooded basement just in time. These weren't statistics. They were people. Faces, names, lives that had been gambled away for the sake of speed ego and unchecked control. When I finished, the room was silent, until Elise leaned forward and asked one question. Mr. Callahan, to your knowledge, did the HOA ever publicly disclose the structural risks or provide alternatives before initiating the bridge construction? I looked directly at Karen. No, ma'am. They never warned anyone. They silenced those who did. Gasps rippled through the room, and then came the flood. Beatrice stood and gave her testimony next, then Arjun. Then Mrs. Dugan, the widow who lived alone at the far end of the neighborhood and nearly lost her dog in the flood. One by one they shared stories, each voice building upon the last, like stones reinforcing a dam. But this dam wouldn't break. It would hold. Because this time, we had each other. Karen's attorney attempted a defense blaming the contractor, arguing that the board acted in good faith, and even insinuating that some homeowners had exaggerated damages for attention. That final statement drew open laughter from the back of the room. Then Elise stood. She clicked on a projector and displayed the contractor's emails, the ones Nolan had turned in. Let me be clear, she said. This was not a case of miscommunication. This was fraud and willful endangerment. The city has concluded its investigation and found probable cause to refer this case to the district attorney's office for further action. Karen paled. Denise, sitting 2 rows behind her, covered her mouth with one hand. Gasps again. But this time there was satisfaction in them. The quiet exhale of justice long denied. Elise continued. Effective immediately, the HOA's authority over discretionary infrastructure projects is suspended. A special oversight committee will be established composed of both city officials and elected residents. Financial restitution will be determined based on the civil suit currently in progress. And as of this afternoon, the HOA board members listed in the report are officially under investigation for breach of fiduciary duty and criminal negligence. She paused, eyes scanning the room. We are not here to destroy community. We are here to protect it. Applause broke like thunder. I stepped outside into the crisp afternoon, the sky overhead finally clear. Lily was waiting for me by the steps, sitting with her knees pulled up to her chest, watching birds circle a line of sycamore trees. She stood when she saw me, her face searching mine. Well, she asked. It's done, I said. She smiled, not wide but deep, the kind that said she understood even if she didn't know every detail. The kind that said maybe, just maybe, she felt proud. We walked home in silence, the weight in my chest lighter with every step. Later that night, I received an email from Elise. Subject, final submission. Inside was a PDF, state findings on unsafe development in HOA-managed communities. On the last page was a line I hadn't expected: special thanks to Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Callahan Ritao for his contributions, diligence, and unwavering commitment to public safety. I stared at it a long time, not because I needed validation, but because after everything, the fines, the threats, the bridge, the collapse, someone had finally put the truth in writing. The winter rains came slower that year. Maybe it was luck. Maybe it was mercy. But Haven Ridge needed the pause, needed time to dry out, to replant, to remember what normal felt like. And under skies that no longer threatened collapse, we started to rebuild. Not just homes, not just fences or basements, but trust. The city held new elections for a reformed HOA committee. This time with independent observers, enforced term limits, and mandatory disclosures. People who had never imagined themselves in community roles now stood up. Beatrice ran. Arjun was nominated unanimously. Even quiet Mr. Hernandez from across the park volunteered to be on the budgeting review team. And me, I said yes. Not because I wanted a title, but because Lily asked me to. She said, "Dad, you've already been doing the job. Maybe now they'll pay you for it." We didn't rebuild the bridge, not right away. The slope was deemed too unstable for another crossing, at least not without major reinforcement and a redesign that respected the land it would sit on. Instead, the city created a task force of hydrologists, engineers, and residents. They met every Tuesday evening in the community center, poring over drainage maps and infrastructure models, and I was there every time. Eventually, we agreed on a design modular elevated with full transparency on its materials construction schedule and contractor selection process. Nolan didn't bid, and no one blamed him. He'd provided everything he could and was working with the city on restitution. The new bridge took 6 months to build. This time, the creek didn't rage during construction. The water moved steadily, respectfully, as if it understood that for once, someone was finally listening. We held a small dedication ceremony the morning it opened. Nothing flashy, just a folding table with coffee and donuts, a couple of folding chairs, and a new sign bolted into the steel Haven Ridge Creek crossing, restored by the community. For the community, people clapped, hugged, laughed. Kids ran across the new walkway without fear. And Lily, now 12 and almost as tall as my shoulder, stood beside me with her camera capturing everything. That afternoon, she uploaded her photos to the new HOA website, a transparent portal with open minutes, budget updates, and a suggestion box that actually got responses. Her pictures got more views than any meeting notice ever had. I stood under the sycamore trees at the edge of the creek and watched the water flow. Clearer now, calmer. The land had a way of speaking when ignored, and a way of healing when honored. And as neighbors walked by, many nodded, smiled, stopped to say thank you. Not just for the bridge, not just for the safety, but for what had changed. For the first time, I wasn't seen as a nuisance or a troublemaker. I was seen as someone who had stayed when it got ugly, as someone who didn't look away. And that meant something. Later that spring, I received a letter from Elise. She'd accepted a promotion heading to the federal agency that oversees HOA accountability nationwide. She thanked me again and asked if she could cite our case in future policy briefs. I said yes, proudly. Before I filed the letter away, I called Luis and read it aloud. He chuckled. You know you could turn this into a whole second career. HOA reformist, the warrior homeowner. God, no, I laughed. One war at a time. But he wasn't wrong. Because the more I looked around, the more I realized how many neighborhoods faced what we did, silence, intimidation, authority without oversight. And maybe it was time more people knew that pushback wasn't chaos. It was courage. Lily agreed. That summer, she started a podcast, Voices from the Fence Line, she called it. Our first episode was about the bridge. She interviewed me, then Beatrice, then Arjun. She edited it herself, added gentle music in the background, and uploaded it without fanfare. Within a week, it had 10,000 downloads. People from other states wrote in. My HOA tried the same stunt. We thought we were alone. Thank you for telling the truth. The story spread, not as scandal, but as warning, as guidepost, as hope. And I realized something I hadn't before: justice isn't a finish line. It's a landscape, uneven, weathered, constantly shifting. But it's also walkable. Together. One steady step at a time. That fall, on a golden afternoon, with wind curling through the branches and laughter echoing from the park, I stood at the new bridge again. Lily beside me. Neighbors passing with waves and warmth. The water flowed beneath us, unobstructed, free. And I let go of the weight I'd carried since the first concrete truck rumbled behind my fence. It didn't bury me. It built something stronger, something worth protecting.